right, Mr. Beamer here. We wanted to thank Hall and Oates' 1980s band for the song Out of Touch. It's referring to President Ulysses S. Grant. And the quote here is all about Grant, and it's really not too positive. You should read that, and wow, okay, not very positive about Grant. He was a great general during the Civil War, but Grant is considered one of the worst presidents. Some say he was out of touch with what was going on around him. All right, so we're moving on to chapter 24, the first half. It's all political. Politics of the Gilded Age, and this term is important, we'll get to in a second. 1869 to 1889 is what this chapter is going to cover. And here are a few of the key topics we're going to talk about in this video. The corruption of Grant's presidency, and I would definitely highlight the word corruption because that definitely applies to his presidency. Another economic panic. Compromise of 1877 we've already talked about a little bit before with Reconstruction. And then the problems for Southern blacks after the year 1877. All right, before we get to the reading, I just wanted to make sure I highlight the term the Gilded Age. This is an era in APUSH 1865 to 1900, and so it was, begins really after the Civil War ends in 1865 and goes to around the turn of the century, 1900. The term Gilded Age was actually coined by one of my biggest favorite people, Mark Twain, great American author. It was actually a book he wrote. Basically, the Gilded Age refers to the shallow display and worship of wealth characteristic of this time period. So, Gilded Age, it looked good on the outside, but in fact there was many bad things going on in America. So this era is also called the Tragic Era or the Dreadful Decade. So this time period, some really cool things happened, but mostly bad. Okay, and this table on the bottom kind of illustrates the good and the bad. Okay, and you can kind of just read through this that there were definitely some good things about industrialization, but also some bad things that overshadowed the good. Same thing with urbanization and immigration, some of the big topics of the Gilded Age. The first section of reading is the Bloody Shirt elects Grant. We're talking about the election of 1868, and so this is after the presidency of Andrew Johnson was finished by 1869. So Republicans, I would highlight this, was what Grant was. A little bit of presidential knowledge from Grant up until Woodrow Wilson. Every single president was a Republican except for one, and that was Grover Cleveland. So on the president's quizzes during the Gilded Age, if you don't know, I'd put down Republican. You're probably going to get it right. Okay, the Democrats don't need to know about this election. They were not very well. They're not organized well, and so they really didn't have a chance. Grant easily wins. But it was rather close in the popular vote, and the Republicans definitely did not want to take their win for granted. Nah! All right, highlight this term, waving the bloody shirt. It's a must-know in APUSH. Basically, the Republicans, in order to get support, would wave the bloody shirt, and this refers to veterans of veterans of the Civil War. The veterans loved Grant. He was a great general of the Civil War. And they would get support for Grant by trying to make people remember the success Grant had in the Civil War. So the Civil War veterans were very much for Grant, and he was able to be elected during 2 elections. We're going to talk about the era of good stealings. Ooh, didn't see that there. So this time period, there was a lot of corruption. I would highlight that. A lot of corruption during the Gilded Age in general, but corruption also occurred during Grant's presidency. Let's talk about some of the corruption. I think the most corrupt organization in APUSH, maybe in American history, fire up, this is not a good thing, is the railroad. Okay, the railroads were very corrupt, and I'm not a fan, and they had a lot of power, a lot of influence in America. Not a fan. We'll get to them in chapter 25. All right, anything else I wanted to highlight? I would definitely go down to this one down here. Okay, I would highlight Tammany in the Tweed ring. Okay, what this was, Tammany Hall was the name of the political organization or the political machine in New York City. Highlight this, and they're headed by a man named Boss Tweed. His full name was William Marcy Tweed. Don't need to know that. We'll just call him Boss Tweed. He was in charge of this political organization, and they were very corrupt in New York City politics. They used bribery, graft, fake elections, and they would cheat city and people out of money. And so bad people in APUSH. But a name we've seen before, Thomas Nast. He's a cartoonist, the cartoonist you must know in APUSH. He is able to expose the corruption of Tammany Hall, and he helps bring Boss Tweed down and force him to eventually go to jail. We got a couple cartoons trying to illustrate Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, the political machine in New York City, and there it is, Boss Tweed. He was a rather large man, and so that's anytime you see large men, think of either Taft, Grover Cleveland, or Boss Tweed. And there's a picture of a money bag on for his head, and so he was definitely corrupt and made a ton of money through his political organization. And there's Thomas Nast, one of his political cartoons, and hopefully you can tell which one's Boss Tweed. Just look for the relatively biggest guy. There he is. And basically he tried to show that there was corruption, and it was very difficult to arrest people for the corruption of Tammany Hall, stealing people's money, rigging elections in New York City. But he was very successful, Thomas Nast, in bringing down Boss Tweed by the 1870s. All right, more corruption this one time. Now we're going to talk about Grant. So his presidency, you need to know, was very corrupt. Now, I'm a fan of Grant overall, especially during the Civil War. His presidency, I'm not a fan of, but again, he himself was not corrupt. It wasn't really Grant, but it was the people around him, and he did not see the corruption within his administration. He was kind of out of touch. There's the song by Hall and Oates, out of touch with what was going on, and so he still is to be blamed for the corruption, even though he was not really a part of it. All right, so the three ones I want you to know, the three events in APUSH that deal with Grant's corruption are the Credit Mobilier scandal, so I'd highlight this, the Whiskey Ring of 1875, and the Indian Affairs scandal during his presidency. Of the three, the most important is probably the Credit Mobilier scandal. What you should know about the Credit Mobilier, it was a railroad scandal. Again, the railroad, very corrupt organization, and basically the railroads were able to give money to congressmen, including Grant's vice president, so that's pretty illegal. So this is a big scandal that made Grant look bad, even though he wasn't involved. The Whiskey Ring was where people in Grant's administration robbed the federal government's treasury, the federal money, of millions of dollars. His own secretary was involved. Again, Grant was not, but people around him were involved in this whiskey scandal, stealing money from the government. And the final one was Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, took bribes, sold junky supplies, food to the Indians, made money off it. And this is the Indian Affairs scandal that occurred underneath Grant's presidency. All right, the next section is the Liberal Republican Revolt of 1872. Not going to get much detail here. See the word liberal? Liberal need to make the connection to change and reform. So they wanted to make changes to the corruption of Grant's presidency. So these people were kind of against Grant. So the Liberal Republicans actually joined up with the Democrats to nominate reformer Horace Greeley in the election of 1872. So what you need to know is that Grant does win the election. They're able to wave the bloody shirt and get the veterans to support him. But just realize there were some Republicans who were looking to try to make changes, reform the political party during this election. All right, continuing depression and demands for inflation. And so here's our next panic of 1873. We've had three other panics. Maybe you can kind of recall that. Of the 1800s, the first one was 1819, then 1837, and 1857. And so the next one is 1873, and this is a pretty severe one. It's not the worst one. The worst panic is going to be in 1893. We'll get to that later. All right, so causes. Well, the causes are typical of all the panics. Over-speculation of land, in this case, especially railroad lands, and also overproduction of goods. These are the two main causes of all the panics of the 1800s. And so I'm going to go over cheap versus hard money in the next slide. But this is an issue during this election, and cheap versus hard money becomes a big issue over the next 20 years. And eventually the issue of silver is going to become a big part of this currency issue. Silver, I'll say this right now, maybe you want to highlight this, write this down. Silver, we consider that part of cheap money during the late 1800s. All right, in this next slide, I just want to go over hard money versus soft money, or another way to put it is sound money versus cheap money. Now, this can get a little bit confusing. I think for APUSH, we'll just give you the basics that you need to know to help you be successful later. All right, so I'd highlight the term soft money. Maybe just realize that soft money deals with cheap money, same idea. And basically, the people that supported soft money is they want more paper currency in circulation, We can think of it today as like more dollar bills, more cash. Let's have the government make more money, put it in circulation. And the term back then was greenbacks to refer to cash or paper money. Well, why do they want that? Because if you support soft money, more money in circulation, you want higher prices and you want inflation. I also would highlight that these people of soft money eventually are going to support silver. So for the late 1800s, silver is tied in with soft money. As I mentioned, the supporters of soft money want inflation to go up. They want higher prices, and the people that want this are farmers. I would highlight this. People in debt want higher prices, especially farmers, because they want to sell their crops for the highest price possible. And we have inflation, the prices are going to be higher. Well, there's got to be some people who do not like soft money, and they are for hard money or for more sound financial policy. And the hard money people want less paper money in circulation. They actually want gold. They want things to be paid for in gold, especially in coins. And so if you're a hard money person, you want lower inflation, and this is going to help the bankers. And over the next 20 years, the late 1800s, the Gilded Age, there's a conflict, especially between farmers and the bankers. Okay, the Resumption Act, do not highlight this, don't worry about this, but realize that there's going to be conflict over the next 20 years from the 1870s to 1890s. Are we going to have a soft money policy or hard money policy? And the key thing is there is conflict developing between the hard and soft money people in America. All right, a little bit more with this section. We can talk about the greenbacks, so highlight them. They want paper money. They want more money issued to have higher inflation. They want inflation, especially the farmers. They also are going to want more silver. Silver was a lot more in supply, and so when there's more silver easily found, prices will rise. We'll have more inflation. However, the hard money people were able to persuade Grant during his presidency to veto a bill to print more money. And so Grant, I would highlight this, he favors a more sound money policy. So Grant is more for hard money. And in general, rule of thumb, maybe you want to write this down, is that Republicans in general are more for a sound money or hard money policy. Last thing, do not highlight the Bland-Allison Act of 1878, but realize that occasionally Republicans did give in and did try to help out the farmers and have a little bit of a soft money policy. They decided to coin more silver by 1878, but this really did not raise the inflation that the farmers wanted. All right, the Pallid politics in the Gilded Age, a little bit of alliteration here. The word pallid means dull, lacking sparkle or liveliness, a lot like this video right now. Basically, the Gilded Age politics is kind of confusing, but there wasn't a whole lot of like major differences between the political parties. So what do I want you to know? Well, here it is. All right, so some of the differences between Republicans and Democrats during the Gilded Age, what I need to know is that in general, Republicans were more in the North for sure because of the abolitionists, and they did have some support in the West. Democrats had most of their support in the South, so that's definitely a difference there. Later in the 1800s, some Westerners are starting to support the Democrats a little bit more. The war veterans, the Guard, the Grand Army of the Republic, very much supports Republicans. The Democrats are getting some support in urban areas, especially with the immigrants coming over in New York City and Boston. All right, there was also a split in the Republican Party during the Gilded Age in the 1870s and 1880s, and these two terms are called stalwarts and half-breeds. I would highlight these two terms. These are Republicans, but the party was split during this time period. And so what were the general beliefs of each? The stalwarts had more corruption in there, and their leader was a guy named Roscoe Conkling. I would highlight him. He was a stalwart, one of the most corrupt people in American history, and they had more corruption. The half-breeds were not happy with the stalwarts for different reasons, but biggest one is they wanted more reforms. So they wanted more reform to end some of the political corruption. So we look upon the half-breeds a little more positive than the stalwarts, and their leader was a guy named James G. Blaine, the Continental Lighter from the state of Maine. Hey, that rhymed. Yeah, more politics, the election of 1876, which is a very important election. So it's more important than the previous two. All right, so in 1876 election, Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes. His nickname was the Great Unknown. I don't even know if that's a good nickname or not. The Democrats picked Samuel Tilden. He also was one of the people, along with Thomas Nast, to bring down Boss, Tweed, and Tammany. So he was pretty famous during this time period. So we got this election going on, extremely close. I would highlight this. The election of 1876 was one of the closest elections in a push. And Tilden, Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, actually got 184 electoral votes. He just needed one more to win the election. And so in this election, Tilden actually had more popular votes than Hayes did. Any other connections in previous elections? Jackson, 1824, the corrupt bargain, had more than Q Adams. All right. So anyway, so what's going on here? So now we don't know who's going to be president. Tilden had the most electoral votes. He was very close. But there was some discrepancy in 4 states. You don't need to know the 4 states, but Congress was going to decide who was going to win this election. And now we're going to get into some compromise. All right, the Compromise of 1877 and the End of Reconstruction. We've already learned about this a little bit from chapter 23. So the Electoral Count Act was passed in 1877, did determine the winner. Don't worry about highlighting this. Basically what happened is Congress had a commission try to decide who's going to win. And on this commission of 15 men were from the Senate, House, and the Supreme Court. 7 of the 15 were Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. So these 15 men had to decide who's going to win, Tilden or Hayes. Well, the Supreme Court Justice Davis resigned at the last moment, and he wanted no part of this. He was the independent, and so he resigns, and so now only Republican-leaning justices are left to fill his spot. So you guessed it, there were basically 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, is able to win. And this compromise, we'll get to in a second, is the Compromise of 1877. Okay, I think you should be familiar with this, but let's review the Compromise of 1877. So Hayes becomes president. He was a Republican. So the Republican gets the presidency, and so they get that, highlight that. In the South, mostly were Democrats, if you remember. They got the last remaining troops kicked out of the South in Louisiana and South Carolina, and the federal government also had to sponsor a transcontinental railroad. Well, it never did happen, but for the South, they're probably happy because the military troops, the federal government's troops, were out of the South. Military Reconstruction is over, and in the end, 1877 is a significant year. That is the end of Reconstruction, when the troops leave the South in 1877. And we know the group that suffers the most because of this compromise were the freedmen in the South, because now they had no federal protection, and the Redeemer governments take over. All right, the last slide. So the Redeemer governments regained power in the South in 1877. The Southern black cause is doomed. This is very important. Highlight this. By the 1890s, I want you to know this decade, this is when the blacks in the South really started to lose their rights and have it. All right, so let's look at this. By the 1890s, literacy requirements for these blacks in the South. So basically, high literacy tests were mandatory for blacks for voting. So they had to be able to read. If they could not read, they could not vote. However, if you were a white person, you had the grandfather clause was put in place. Basically, what the grandfather clause was, in 1860, if your grandfather voted, you did not have to take literacy tests. Well, the only people in 1860 that voted in the South were white people, so the whites basically were excluded from taking literacy tests. The blacks had to take it, unfair. Voter registration laws were also passed in the South, limiting blacks, making it very difficult to register. You can't vote if you're not registered. Poll taxes, highlight this, were created to make the blacks. They had to pay a tax in order to vote. Many of them were poor because they were sharecroppers, could not pay this tax, could not vote. By the way, this ends with the 24th Amendment in the 1960s. And then this is huge. Segregation really begins in the South. These are called Jim Crow laws. The separation of white and black public facilities, theaters, restrooms, and schools really begins in the 1890s. And finally, highlight this, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, a must-know and a push. This is a Supreme Court decision that said separate but equal is okay. Okay, there can be separate white and black facilities. Our federal government said that is legal as long as the facilities were equal, but they were never equal. They were never enforced by the government, and so this is huge. And so finally, what Supreme Court decision ends Plessy v. Ferguson?